Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to my conversation with Paul VanderKlay. It's our third conversation. I'll give some context for that in a moment. First, some housekeeping. My company, the Circling Institute, which we give trainings for basically on how to lead circles, how to experience circling, how to that lead into the kind of in-depth conversations and intimacy and openings that I think you'll see in many ways demonstrated through a lot of the videos on this channel. Circling Institute is the place where I get to teach and people get to just show up and actually practice this stuff. So if you're interested in that, Circling Institute, link is below. We have a Thursday night open to everybody, 6 to 9, West Coast time, California time. We have a weekend coming up this weekend, the 5th and 6th, and the Art of Circling is open for registration. So links for that, all that below. If you're interested in working with me one-on-one, my email's below. Just email me. All right. So it's my third conversation with Paul. It's really great to see him again. He's such a great guy. Talked a lot about for him being a pasture and having a public face and being a pasture and the complexities that go along with that. His past, right? His relationship with his parents and everything that went into having a couple of pastures in his background. God, we covered so many different things. But I would say the place in which the conversation circled around, right? It was circling around this sense of God and the hiddenness of God, the quality of the sacred that is necessarily revealed in its concealment, and the different ways that is, as human beings, the different ways that we can relate to that or not relate to that. I think that this conversation really circled deeply around that profound, deeply humbling topic. Enjoy. All right. Yeah, you're right. We do both do things that have changed. It's funny. It's we had been thinking for a long time in my company, right, of like, okay, we got to start doing stuff online, but I was always so resistant to it, right? Almost for I almost didn't even want it to work online, right? Because I'm just what's now, I guess you could call it old school, right? Because I wanted to do everything in person,
right?
And so doing this, it forced us to put everything online. And I'm really quite surprised at like how well it works. You'd think something about which the whole thing is about, a practice of relating and relationship, that it would make a huge, a dramatic difference. It would no longer be what it was if you remove the in-person body. But I think when you get into conversation, right, there's something about a conversation that as long as there's conversing, there's a world that it forms, right? And you can find yourself sealed in that world, right? And that's the relationship, right, that happens. So I guess if you remove, although it'd be interesting to look at like what is the difference though, right, when you remove embodiment, right? From real.
Well, and that's what I've noticed too. There have been moments that I've been really surprised how much you can do.
Yeah.
And then also almost always forced to realize the limitations, even if you can't necessarily articulate what those limitations are.
Yeah.
They show up, but you realize, yeah, there's a deficiency. I was just talking to someone yesterday about something that he wanted to do in his church, and he wanted me involved. And I told him, I said, I would not try to relate to people at that level in a room with masks on. You know, we've got enough experience with masks now that any kind of significant relational conversation, you need to see people's faces in order to recalibrate.
Yeah.
We communicate so much, and we communicate more than we know.
Right.
So it's a strange year we're living in.
Are you doing a lot of stuff? Are you doing a lot of the church stuff online, or like how is this affecting COVID affecting what you're doing?
Well, we have, so because I have so many older people in the church, they can't, you know, our Bible studies, our small groups moved online, but many people didn't have computers, didn't have broadband.
Yeah.
They have old computers. They might have a 10-year-old computer without a camera, and I'll say, you should really get a new computer.
Yeah.
And they can afford it. Some of them can.
Yeah.
And they won't spend the money. It's like,
yeah.
But because they don't see the value. And
right.
So we've maintained local services almost throughout. There's a brief period in March and April when we paused. And then because hospitals are filling up here, we're contemplating another brief pause, maybe a few weeks. But but even so, the numbers are very small. We have a big enough room that we can easily have lots of distance. We ask that people wear masks, especially if they sing. And we saw in that first pause that the toll the isolation was taking, especially on seniors that live alone, was bad. And even if they didn't come every week, if they had a safe-ish place to come, that was better than, sort of forcing them into isolation. Or some of them, most people have family members that are just sort of not wearing masks, not paying any attention to anything like that. And that tends to be the places where you'll hear they had a family reunion and you had, 10 people get infected because, so it's all, working out the details, and trying to balance all the things. But it's, we do things online. And, I just finished talking to someone who has been, he's been, because he had, cancer treatment, he's basically been in isolation for 3.5 years. So, and then and I was just before this, I was thinking about doing a video, thinking about church and COVID, and thinking about just how crappy Zoom and streaming is. And I just had this conversation with this guy, and he said, I'd had a bad doctor and I was hating this doctor, and I was watching your church live stream and you were talking about forgiving. I thought, okay, we'll keep the live stream. I mean, it's all this kind of thing. You can't get away from it.
Yeah.
And even if watching online for a host of reasons is impoverished compared to being present, it's sometimes better than nothing. So we'll keep doing it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's also just interesting to think about this, because I mean, I've been struck by just how much actually does come through this form, right? About, in some sense, your body, for example, when it works, it doesn't show up for you. Like there's a way in which, the context of embodiment, when it works, it's actually, no one's embodying anything. It's just working because it disappears. So there's something about really interesting to kind of get how, questions of what is a self, who is another, and how much it's in cooperation with language. And there is this thing, what I have heard about, right, a lot is, when you meet somebody, like if somebody comes over to your house, right, there's the beginning and then there's the end. And that's a very distinct thing, right? If you just think about all the rituals that take place when somebody comes over, right? There's the awareness of somebody coming over, there's the knock at the door, there's them coming up to the door, there's this awareness of like privacy, and you're going from a public space to a private space, and it's their private space, and you're entering somebody your house, and there's this whole like set of implicit and explicit formalities, right, that happen in that coming into relation and having somebody come in. And then the series of rituals of when they leave, right? There's all these things. So like, do you have your coat? Do you have your things? And oh no, let me get the door. And there's a whole kind of thing that happens at the beginning and the end. And what's interesting about this medium is you just press a button, boom, it's over.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that, I think, is really, really quite striking for people. And it has me wonder to what degree that those two horizons being changed on the front end and the back end, like to what degree that somehow affects the interaction or not.
Yeah, that's really true. That's
right.
Really true. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I've done how many hundreds of these things, but I never really thought about that, and those rituals and those traditions.
Right.
Yeah. And your point about embodiment is true too. When you're healthy, it's very
right.
Your body disappears.
Yeah.
When you're pounding a nail, the hammer disappears.
Yeah.
We are strange creatures with strange abilities.
Oh,
we really are.
Absolutely.
We really are. So what did you wanted to talk about God? So now you really had my interest when you said I want to talk about God.
Yeah.
So well, this will be interesting. So what are you thinking about? Tell me what you want to talk about.
Well, I mean, on some level, that's all I've ever been thinking about, right? Is God, right? And I've noticed because, in fact, I was just listening to your last conversation, the three-way that you had with the Owen Barfield guy and the other guy.
Oh yeah.
I really liked it.
The two Michaels.
I got about halfway through and I really liked it. And actually, you mentioned something about, you referenced something called the middle voice. There's the first voice and the middle voice. And what I didn't quite understand.
Active, passive, and middle. Greek has a middle voice. Active is I run. Passive is, the dog was run or the car was run or something like that. It's you're the recipient of the action. And I really thought about this, when Michael, who was the Barfield scholar, brought this up with respect to, I really thought about this with respect to Vervaeke's stuff, because a lot of Vervaeke's stuff is very middle voice-ish. It's in the middle between the active and the passive. And we don't have that in English. And it's much more, again, participatory. And a lot of theological blood has been shed and ink has been expended on the difference between the active and the passive with respect to us and God.
Yeah.
And there are areas in which, does prayer change God or does prayer change us? With Calvinism, does God save us or do we save ourselves? And so almost, and you see these strange inconsistencies. So Calvinists are supposed to, in terms of the theological tribes, are supposed to be the ones in which humanity is enormously passive and there's no agency. But you find Calvinists being incredibly active and activistic and exhorting people to go to church or stop doing this or this. It's like, if you really believed in human passivity, you wouldn't be saying or doing any of these things. So something's out of whack there. And so, the middle voice, and it's been a while since I've studied Greek and paid attention to Greek grammar, except in the process of
actual grammatic kind of linguistic structure in Greek. So it's like, so for example, it'd be something like there's female words and male words in French.
Male, female, and neuter in Greek too. So there's those three in Greek as well.
So there's a middle voice.
But there's the middle voice, and I remember learning that in when I was learning Greek, and it's like, as always, when you learn a new language, when you find a construction that you don't have in your own language, the only way to really get a sense of it is to get into that language. And one thing I learned in having to learn Spanish and then live and work in Spanish when I was a foreign missionary, once you, especially as an adult, once you learn another language and you get beyond mere translating, you do sort of become a different person. And there's a you in that context that is different from you in another context. You start dreaming in the other language. Our relationship with language is very tight and very nuanced. So so these affordances in other languages are significant, and the fact of a middle voice, especially when you get into something like Barfield, where everything is participatory, and of course the same for Heidegger, of course, where where we started talking about with respect to we stop seeing Zoom and we start seeing each other. And we stop recognizing we're seeing through eyes and we focus on the other eyes. It's this thing that we are, this almost, it's almost a translucent avatar that we sort of, we're sort of moving around, and then agency, the agency of this avatar very much becomes participatory. So
totally. Well, I was going to ask you, because since we last talked, I don't think this was in place when we last talked, but you now have one of those servers,
Discord
server, right? Which is a community of people that are gathered roughly in being interested in the conversations that you've started here on your channel. And it's so you have, like, I would imagine, and then you go and you participate in it, right? Like you go and do question and answer, and there's a community in which is formed, a gathering around the conversations. What is that like?
So the server started, we started our local meetup. And a number of the people in the meetup liked it well, and so well. We would have visitors coming in from other parts of the country for our local meetup, which was really flattering. But our members said, there's a lot of people who want to talk about stuff like this, like we talk about here, and they can't. What can we do for them? And a bunch of these are young men mostly, and so they're gamers, so they play computer. Well, let's start a Discord server. It's free. We can start it. And so the first time we started it, nothing happened. The second time we did, it really took off. And that's been also an avenue of exploration, because when you start something like this with human beings, you don't know what's going to happen. And Discord is a strange platform. You've got voice chat capacities, you've got video chat capacities. It's mostly text chat, and it's free. You don't have to pay anything to sign up. You don't have to pay anything for a server. And so then what happened? Well, so Job, who I had a number of conversations with, was talking with a bunch of the guys in the meetup. Job sort of became the pastor of the Discord server. And this happened because we started it, and then we started going to voice chat, and he started doing on the server what he and I had done and what he had seen me do on my YouTube channel. In other words, inviting people into the conversation, sharing their lives, about an hour or so of helping them tell their story. And then we did another very undiscord thing, which is that we created a culture where you gain status by using your real name on the server, not a little avatar and a little internet name.
Yeah.
And so the server has continued to grow and continued to evolve. I started doing, a lot of people do question and answer type things on YouTube. I wanted a forum which was more interactive, so I started doing that on the Discord server. And that way they ask me a question, I can answer it, but I can also have them say, no, that wasn't really what I was asking.
Yeah.
Or this is what I was thinking. So we could actually have a conversation.
Right.
So, and then we've done watch parties where there'll be a video and you'll start a watch party and other people come, and then you can text chat while we're listening to it.
Yeah.
Lately, I have no love of, let me say it this way. So many of the administrative chores that are simply common to running a church, I find very meaningless. And so I avoid them and procrastinate with them. And most jobs have this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so lately, part of what I've been doing on the server is I will go into a chat room and I will turn on my camera. And it's another thing that we've been learning, that text chatting is one thing, voice chatting is another. But if we can turn on our cameras and see each other, that adds another dimensionality. So, and for me, so obviously what happens when you start a YouTube channel and you go from 15 subscribers to a couple thousand subscribers to 15,000 subscribers, you blow away your Dunbar number, and you have to, but if you're a pastor, you really have to treat people like individuals. And you really don't want to blow people off. And you really want to embody the fact that their individual stories matter.
Right.
15,000 people and that posture do not get along very well.
Right.
So what the Discord server has sort of become is, at least for the kinds of people who can handle the Discord technology, has become an estuary of sorts, because enough of the culture that I have established on my channel has gotten into the culture of the group that there is a level of expectation about treatment of individuals that has been perpetuated in that server. That server is not everyone's cup of tea. There's a Dunbar number effect to that server too. There are limitations to the technology, but I now have a high degree of confidence that if someone watches my channel and they want to engage in conversation, if they go to the Discord, there's at least a chance they might find a level of community that they will find helpful for addressing common loneliness, having a space where they can have a conversation with another person one-on-one or in a small group setting. So in some ways, the Discord server has sort of become a church, which is really strange, because that's how churches function.
Right. Oh, interesting.
And it's very much a work in process.
So there's something about, so essentially you starting the Discord server, a lot
I didn't even start it. The guys started it. That's an important distinction.
Right. Okay. Got it. Yes.
Because if I had to run it, it would be a mess.
Yeah. Yeah. That pretty much, goes for almost everything that's sustained in my life. If I had to run it, it would be a crumpled up piece of paper in the backseat of my car or something. Yeah, totally. So I definitely appreciate that. So there's a way in which for you, well, a couple of things. One of the things I heard like to what degree you actually are a pasture, right? Because what I explicitly heard you say, that relationship between 15,000 people and you, and the obligation of a pasture is to see each person as an individual. Like the math on that, right, is intense. So in some ways, this has helped distribute that, right? The in a way that's church-like, which is probably something I don't know if you expected anything of it. I don't know if you expected that or.
I hoped for it, because that similar dynamic happens in church. Because even in a small church like this, there's one pastor, and there's way more need, even in a small congregation, than one pastor can immediately address. And so churches, by their design, are always distributed agencies.
Yeah.
So you have small groups, you have family units, you have elder districts. And so churches are always about having community scale down.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Huh. Interesting. And what's it been like? Has that affected? Well, I actually have a couple of questions that came up for me. Is like, one, being a pastor, you're that role of being a pastor is so intriguing to me. I actually did for 6 months, I taught a group of pastors, right? Circling essentially. And I really was kind of struck by that role of being this in between, right? Between the community and God, in some sense, a mediator and a translator, and the profundity of it's really struck me. And so I just really heard it when you said, like, oh yeah, as a pastor, even looking at the people that are subscribed to my channels, I'm still obligated as a pastor. How is there any point in your life when you're not a pastor? Like, is there any place in your life where you're not a pastor?
If I talk to my wife in a certain way, she'll look at me and, don't pastor me.
Yeah.
No, that's, that it is an office that you fulfill, and it's a role that you play.
Yeah.
And it's not uncommon, especially in a small church. Someone comes into the church, they become a Christian, they're in the middle of a big life transformation, and you've sort of been the midwife of that transformation, and now you and I are going to be best friends. And it's like, I really hate to disappoint you, because you've sort of, it's like when people fall in love with their therapists.
Yeah.
The therapist was serving something. And so you have to kind of ease people through those things. And this is actually quite difficult for pastors, because pastoring can be very lonely because of some of these things. It's difficult. You can live in very intense relationships with people in your church. And sometimes they are your friends and sometimes they're not, but the pastoring and the friendship can kind of get in the middle. And so sometimes you need friendships outside the church.
Yeah.
So because it's a traditional institution and not a modern one, like a therapist is a very modern institution.
Yeah.
Here's the walls of the room. This is what we do in these walls. Outside of these walls, totally different relationship, not a pastor.
Right.
So there's lots and lots and lots to this, especially and if you get into differentiation of, let's say, a pastor and a priest. because pastors do that priestly role,
Mm-hmm.
but they also do other roles that priests may or may not do.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on there.
Right.
But again, in a pastor who has a YouTube channel, that's new territory.
Yeah, they missed that one when they wrote the Bible.
Or went to seminary.
Right, yeah. I mean, I would imagine there's just so much of that for you in these brand new questions that on some level really have not been asked or experienced that you're probably asking yourself, I would imagine, right? As a pastor, like being a public face, but being a public face in this medium, right? And what are my obligations to that? Am I still a pastor in this being a public face? Am I just me? What's the difference between those two? I mean, these are really, really, really interesting questions.
And it's different from being let's say, a church pastor.
Yeah.
So if you're pastoring a congregation of 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000, and there are congregations out there like that, that's different too. And like, it's like, I have the Calendly thing to get, to the randos conversations and such, and people are always complaining they can't get a slot. The truth is they can walk in the door on a Sunday morning and have pretty good access to me just by being here.
Yeah.
But it's on the internet that, I'm hard to get a hold of.
Right.
And so there's all these weird dimensionalities.
That's really interesting.
So it is a bizarre thing. And I remember when, that first one of those early videos took off, and I went from 15 YouTube subscribers for random local church people and family who, were going to kind of support Freddie by watching the Freddie and Paul show, to 2000. Say at 2000, it was like, okay, I'd stop, let's no more new subscribers. Let's just stop here.
Yes.
And that didn't happen.
Right.
And so then it's okay. And so now for me too, is my church going to survive COVID? I don't know. Am I going to be a YouTube pastor? I don't know. I don't know where this thing goes. And so it's, the Discord server, that was a whole new thing. So it's all exploration. But again, it's all mediated by the office and role of pastor and the traditions within that.
Right. Huh.
So, and it's weird. But I mean, you're doing lots of new things too.
Yeah.
You invented this circling, and I mean, so.
Well, it's so interesting. It always impresses me, Paul, in that sense of just, I've always thought this in relationship with you, but like when I talk with you, I'm just, there's something about live conversations where I'm like, really, I find myself putting myself in your shoes, and it's so interesting because of this. There's a tradition that goes very deep, right? Like, and then a facing and an openness to the new, which I know with that tradition, its relationship to the new has been, it's that has not been uncomplex, throughout. And so it strikes me as a tension that you hold really well. But when you said it like this, when you said, and I don't know where it goes, right? I think that it seems to me, at least from watching you, tell me if this is true, but from watching you, it seems to me that you're aware in a conscious way that there's an it that's going somewhere, right? That you don't know where it goes, but there's a way where you've piped yourself right up to the face of that change, right? And you've really opened to it, right? And you've been talking to all kinds of people, right? While being a pastor, right? Which is just so, it's so impressive. Yeah, it's so impressive to me.
Well, I'm also a third generation pastor. So my grandfather, oh boy, you're right. These things go deep.
Yeah.
I was doing some genealogy things with a guy on the Discord server who used to be a Hasidic Jew, and a number of years ago we discovered that on my father's side of the family they were Jews, and so we're trying to figure out at what point they sort of left the Jewish community, and and how this intersected with immigration to the United States in the 1890s. And so then it was my great grandfather who came in over as a 19-year-old to establish himself, to bring my great great grandfather and some of the other family in. And I think at that point they had probably been exiled from their Jewish community in the Netherlands. And then my grandfather, and so then they go to Western Michigan and they become part of Spring Lake Christian Reformed Church. And then my grandfather becomes a pastor. So there was a leaving of the Jewish community and the Jewish religion, and then at some point an embrace of this Dutch Calvinism in Western Michigan, to the degree that my grandfather decided to become a minister. And my grandfather was known to be a rather dull preacher. In fact, he was such a dull preacher that at one point back in those days, churches would basically extend calls. It's how to recruit someone. Pastor sight unseen, and my grandfather came and preached in their church, and the church decided they didn't want him because his sermon was so dull. But he basically stonewalled them, and they didn't, because of the strangeness of Christian Reformed rules and regulations, they couldn't really fire him after he had accepted the call. But they grew to love him because he cared for people so well and loved people well. And so then, he wasn't as much of a preacher as he was a pastor.
Yeah.
And then my father's story was different in that he goes to Paterson, New Jersey. Very different context. My grandfather had been in Depression era churches throughout the Midwest and then into Canada. And then my father goes to Paterson, New Jersey, and works with Black folks. And I don't think my father had any personal experience with the African American community until he goes to Paterson. But my father was quite a bit of a better preacher, because my grandmother would have been a great preacher, but women weren't preachers back in the day.
Oh, yes. Right.
But my father was a very good preacher, but also had that pastoral heart of his father, and ministered to people at every level in Paterson. So all of these things were built into me before I could have any conception of them. And then I didn't want to be a local church pastor. I got kind of backed into it after. I would have rather done teaching or those kinds of things. But as it turned out, I wound up here in this church and found I loved it. And all of what had been built in by my ancestry, by watching my father and my grandfather, came into me. But now, my great grandfather was an immigrant from the Netherlands who somehow joined the Dutch Reformed Church. My grandfather becomes a minister in that and pastors to mostly dairy farmers in the Midwest and Canada, and then some on the East Coast. My father then pastors to African Americans, and I become a foreign missionary and then pastor to a very multicultural community in Sacramento, and then onto YouTube and discord. And, it's, when you look at it generationally, it's like, it's rather breathtaking.
Yeah.
But the traditions and the values continue through the technologies and the different communities.
Right. Interesting. So you have a couple of generations back that you're really built, like, it's tradition, it's your personal tradition as well, right? That goes directly in your bloodline through this. When you tell me about when you became a pastor, you said you weren't expecting to do that.
I didn't want to do that.
You didn't want to do it. What was it before?
Because
what was it before you? What was pastoring when you weren't wanting it? What weren't you wanting when before you were?
It was all the differentiation stuff, I think, from from the genetic and parenting legacy I had. I wanted to differentiate myself from Stan, my father. In Patterson, in the Black community, the pastor is a big deal, even if the church is a small deal. And I was little Rev, and I look like him, and I sound like him, and I walk like him, and I was the only son in the family. And so there was and my father never put any of this on me. My parents never put any of this on me.
Right.
But I wanted to differentiate. And so I had a terrible time in college deciding what I wanted to do. I was in engineering, I was in math, I was in history, but I just really liked theology. And I liked philosophy. And so I decided then to go to seminary, and I didn't want to become a local church pastor. So I thought, well, maybe I can teach theology. Maybe I'll get into the academia. And then I met my wife, and she very much wanted to do foreign missions. And so that was easy, because foreign missionaries, they don't do any pastoring. They just teach. And then they get to have different cultures. And I liked cultures. So foreign missionary work was sort of a way out.
Yeah.
But that, we had him back to the United States, for a variety of reasons. And then suddenly, what was I going to do for a living? And I was fixing computers for a while, and teaching therapists how to work PCs, because they had to start putting things in PCs, and therapists didn't know anything about computers.
Right.
And then, I needed to earn more money for my family in the Christian Reformed Church. Being a local church pastor, you can live on that. Right. And so I had the degree, I had the credential, and so I had the skill set.
Yeah.
So, and then I had a church in Chicago wanted me, and this church in Sacramento, and the church in Sacramento just looked like they needed me more than the church in Chicago. Yeah. And it was much closer to what I had grown up in terms of a multicultural community, a significant African-American population. And so it fit. And so I came here and I started this, and very quickly I discovered I liked it.
How long ago was that?
23 years ago.
Okay, gotcha.
I very quickly discovered I enjoyed it. I really liked it. And the first day I walked to work, there was a woman sitting in the parking lot with a suitcase, and okay. When I took this call, they didn't tell me about all the homeless folks in the group homes and any of that, but all of that I'd grown up with in Patterson with my father. And so I'd always lived with that population. That wasn't any problem at all.
Yeah.
I deal with homeless people and mental illness and poverty and everything that goes along with it. That's what I'd grown up in terms of watching my father minister to those people. And the key thing, though, is seeing my father. I mean, we could, and you get this with doctors and therapists and, mental health workers, you get a certain gallows humor of the despair of so many situations.
Right.
But my father was never in any way demeaning, or I never saw him lose patience with the most unbelievably frustrating people doing the most foolish, repetitive, self-destructive things.
Right.
He always treated them with respect. He always treated them with kindness. He always treated them with love, to the degree that I would sometimes pull my hair out and say, how can you walk into this idiocy one more time? And yet he would. And I learned from that. I learned both sides of that, because my mother had considerably less patience with that and some wisdom about that. She would draw a line with people and say, here's the line. And sometimes people need that line. But and so that's, and you know, I saw a lot of that with Jordan Peterson too. You could tell he had paid his dues as a clinical psychologist and a therapist.
Right.
Because I could see him one-on-one treating total strangers with kindness and patience. And when I saw that, that impressed me. And I thought, I'm willing to give this guy a listen, because that's significant.
That, and specifically that ability to have an unconditional regard for the humanity of another person.
That's right.
Independent of their circumstance or the form that they took. That regard to someone's, is it an implicit dignity? What with your dad, like what is that, like how did he, he's like, how the hell did he do that, right? How did he do it?
I'm gonna post the eulogy I gave at, my father had a couple of memorial services. I'm gonna post the eulogy that I gave at the memorial service in Patterson sometime on my channel, and I talk quite a bit more about him. But part of it was just him, how he was wired. But part of it was, so in my grandparents' house, my grandfather took a call to a church in Owen Sound, Ontario. And this was in the 50s, after the Second World War. And Dutch and Frisian immigrants were coming to Canada after the war. And today we would say, they're all suffering from post-traumatic, they had lived through the really brutal occupation of the Nazis in the Netherlands. And they would come to Canada. They would have to have sponsors, but the dairy farmers that would sponsor them, that was sort of a way of farmers getting cheap labor that they could even potentially abuse. So it wasn't even easy for some of these people who came over from the Netherlands to work on dairies in Canada. And if any Dutchman would show up at the train station in Owen Sound, the person working at the train station would call my grandfather. And in the middle of the night, the phone would ring, and and my aunt told these stories. My father was already heading to college, but it talks about the character of my grandfather. Glenda, that's my aunt. You're going to have to go, spend the rest of your night with your brother. We're going to give these people the room, or, whatever you need to do, because we're going to take these people into our house and we're going to feed them. And throughout the Depression, also stories of the hobos would mark the phone poles with chalk until you get in front of the preacher's house. They'd put a special mark there because they know you knock at that door and these people will give you food. And during the Depression, my grandmother, she was a writer too. She wrote an article for the Banner, like, 2 cents and 13 pounds of butter, because the farmers didn't have any cash. So they're all dairymen. So they'd pay the preacher in butter, but how much butter can you eat? But yet my grandparents,
Right.
despite their poverty, they
Right.
never had much money.
Right.
You know, someone comes and knocks at their door, they will feed them. And so that's what my father grew up. This is what a Christian is. So then he goes to Patterson, and a totally different context. This is what a Christian is. These people who show up at your door, they are image bearers of God, and you'd better treat them that way. Yeah. It doesn't matter if they're mentally ill, if they're homeless, if they're, I tell this story in the eulogy. There was once a guy who parents, I get the story wrong, and my mother often corrects it, but I'll tell it the way I remember it. You know, the guy comes, he needs something. And so dad brings him home and he eats dinner with us. And my father liked photography and had this old camera, probably wasn't worth that much. So this guy ate with us. The guy eventually turns around. Our house was always getting broken into because it was a bad neighborhood in Patterson. And so the guy breaks into our house, steals the camera that he had spied when the preacher who had taken him to give him a meal gave him a meal. That's pretty despicable. So the guy gets arrested. My father visits him in jail, and it'd be like, I'd want to give the guy the finger. I gotta, guy visits him. My father visits him in jail, and the guy says, feeling a little guilty. Oh, by the way, I pawned your camera. And so what did my father do? He goes to the pawn shop and buys it back. And it's like, and my father, he would forgive this guy who betrayed his trust. This is the stuff that, this is Jean Valjean type stuff. And father lived that way. And I, as a kid, you don't know what you're watching. This is just imprinting on you. Yeah. Yeah. And so I find myself in this church, how do you treat people? This is how you treat people. Yeah. 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 And then now, yes, people write letters and emails, and it's like, I don't always get to see them, and I don't answer them back. And, I try, but I get weary. But, this is try to pay attention, try to treat them as an individual, try to love them. Right. Right. And it's also, it just seems like what you're talking about, like loving them, treating them as an individual. I mean, these things are inexhaustible, right? I don't know if there's any end to the degree that I could see you, right? I don't know if there's any end to the degree. These things are inexhaustible, like, and mysterious all the way down, right? I think that's the thing that as you're talking about it, I'm noticing the one who's listening as you're talking, right, keeps getting the sense of that. I think on one level, there's what it takes, right, to be able to, the guy who stole from you, to visit him in jail and then go buy back your property. Like where is it that one is, like, what is he looking at? What is he listening to? Who is that? Like, that capacity to see someone and to even when they're completely devastated of any of their own sense of dignity, that the very fact of their existence is that which is deserving of my respect. That sense of being able to be respectful at that deep of a level. What is that's showing to, like, what's glowing forth to him, such that that's the only it's the most matter-of-fact response. What is it that's glowing forth to him and now to you, when you experience that? What is it that you're seeing when you look at somebody and you respond? I don't know that you see it so much, but that's in some ways how you're programmed.
Yeah.
And there's lots of other programming that's saying, don't do this. I mean, and I just had, so, I made a video a little while ago when I put, one of the homeless guys in jail, and he just got out of jail. And in a sense, the system is working because he hasn't shown up at church. He came and got his shopping cart, and I haven't seen him. I know I will see him. He will come back. I know it will happen. And he's probably really pissed at me because, he thought the cops were, he was probably only going to go to jail for a few hours, and he was there for a week. But, and I think it's, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. Obviously it's, theologically the answer is easy, but to live it out.
Yeah.
And it's also not, I mean, Jordan Peterson in 12 Rules for Life has a chapter, which I thought it was the chapter that hit me most, where he basically deconstructed he deconstructed a benevolence that we have. And it was very neat. It was very Nietzschean in that there's a false performative potential to all of this too.
Yeah. I was just going to say,
and that, so it's this, like you say, there's no bottom to this thing.
Right.
Especially if it's in you, there's no bottom to this thing. Because am I trying to, am I trying to impress this other person by my generosity? Am I trying to impress God by my generosity? What I loved about that chapter in that book, which I've never heard anybody else talk about that particular chapter, but it's something that someone in a helping profession would know. Because you might be looking like you're a saint. You might be thinking that you are a saint. You might be impressing the hell out of yourself and other people about your saintliness, but there's a certain degree of self-serving that is going on in your little game. And that needs to be seen in yourself too.
Yeah. So there's a because I was just going to say, when he said, well, on some level it's been programmed into me, and I was like, well, at least the picture I'm having of, especially as you talk about with your dad, I'm like, doesn't seem like he's following a rule. Seems like
no,
he's in a relationship with something that it seems inexhaustible and seems to evoke a concurrent inexhaustibility in response, right? And it's funny because I think one of the reasons why this is kind of hitting me so deeply as you're talking about it is I read that it's a book. Jonathan, who I'm talking with for the first time later this week, is talking with Jonathan Peugeot.
Oh, really? Jonathan's on a tour. This is, I'm loving these conversations he's having.
Yeah, totally. But he had somebody on, I think a month or two ago, who wrote a book on the Christian, like basically the rise of Christendom, right? And specifically, it's a book. Is it called Reform? It's just it has a picture of Jesus on the cross, but you're looking down. It's got a picture of like,
Dominion.
Yeah, Dominion, right?
Oh yeah.
So I'm in the middle of that, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's I don't know. There's something about the way he wrote that really highlights to what degree this sense of looking at being and valuing it, right, as thou, right, this sense of thou, and just in its own factness, that like that inexhaustibility at one point wasn't there, right? And then Jesus comes on, right, on the scene. And I'm just trying, it's so striking to me that like I don't even know if Jesus could understand what Jesus was saying. Right? It was so like, by what horizon of intelligibility could he understand, or anybody understand it, right? In some degrees, that's how it was able to get off the ground, is because the Romans probably couldn't even perceive it, let alone be threatened by it, right? So I think there's something about getting the brutality of the world, right, prior to Christendom, right? That is, I mean, I knew this before, but perhaps this is one of those things where there's no end of depth upon which you can know how deeply the impact of in the revolution Christendom was, right? And before that, it's and it's so part of us that when we look back at our history and we look at the Greeks and the Romans, prior to Christ, we think that we're looking at them, but we cannot not look at them without the frame, which is pretty much our frame, called Christianity. And so since I've been reading that, I'm just really present to that experience of, oh yeah, like this is, people are so Christian, they don't even
know it.
They don't even know it, right? Just the and then what I'm talking about is the basic pre-reflective sense of, when you point at something, just that self-evident somethingness that it is, that you don't even have to think about, it's at that level of, that's where Christianity is, which I think is also giving me a deeper sense of what it means, or what it possibly means, when the explicit sense of Christianity, right, is changing so dramatically, right? And church attendance is down, and all these like, you start thinking about that stuff, and I think we're in a time that's just really striking, in other words, right? Where we can actually see it in our lifetime. We can see these things that used to take thousands of years, right, to change. We're seeing a bunch of them happening in our lifetime, and we can see it, and we can have a conversation about it, right? I think we're in a time that's really, really stunning in that respect. And I think a lot of it has to do with this, everything that we've just been talking about. Yeah.
Holland's book is, no, I really think you're dead on right. I think you're dead on right. And the fact that we're watching this play out so quickly and so dramatically. Mm-hmm. Another thing I think Christians would like to take Holland's book and say, oh, see, it's Jesus. Part of what's interesting to me about Holland's book, and in fact, the story of Christianity, is that even following Jesus, even in Jesus' name, the church didn't avoid being tyrannical. Mm-hmm. And that is, in a sense, what the Protestant Reformation was about. Mm. And Jonathan Peugeot, he had a conversation that was just posted with Adam Friended. And part of the point that Jonathan was making there, is that in modernity, the state sort of has become tyrannical in some ways. Well, in the church has also had its tyrannical moments. And, part of what I took from that book too is I've been reading some more Enlightenment stuff lately. The Enlightenment, for all of the dirt Christians sometimes kick up at it, it was the Enlightenment that was really important in helping the church divorce itself from some of its tyrannical ways, and helping the church develop, to at least to the degree that it can, this universal regard for the outcast, and even people whose suffering is well earned. Because that's, a lot of the people I deal with, their suffering is well earned. And I was just this morning, there was a woman sitting on the brickwork over here by church, and she was having a fight with her husband right out here in the street, which growing up in Patterson was not an unusual circumstance. Whenever there was a fight, everybody came out to watch the fight.
Yeah.
Nobody came out to watch this fight, because this fight was just, she was accusing him of infidelity, and he was accusing her of, and they were just screaming at each other at the top of their lungs, just 20 feet from my door. And so it was like, okay, and should I go out there and sit down with you two and maybe see conversations? I'll leave you two to your misery. But no, the idea which Tom Holland, I think, demonstrates is that Jesus reprogrammed human culture at such a deep level. And it took hundreds and hundreds of years, and in fact, many centuries, for that deep programming to play out. And it's still, and as you said right now, it's still playing out very quickly and very rapidly in our midst. And it's not, unlike a computer rollout that, let's say, I just saw Zoom updated their software and we all get, 5.4.3 or something like that. The reprogramming of us happens in conflict. And there are different, both in terms of our current culture war, which really annoys people on both sides often when I say it, both sides are in some ways manifesting Jesus, even in their fight. Both the woke who, want this ultimate regard and ultimate war against racism and sexism and all of that, and the hidebound traditionalist culture warriors who want to maintain traditional marriage, et cetera, et cetera. Both sides are manifesting Jesus. And neither side is willing to see Jesus in the other.
Right.
And that isn't to say that neither side has something incredibly valuable and important that they're fighting for, but that what we're continuing to work through is this deep reprogramming that Jesus did. And the only way we, unlike a computer where you just click a button and, new code replaces the old code, our distributed cognition system is far deeper and broader and more complex. So, and that then means that the church and all the churches are part of that reprogramming, because it's the church that actually preserves a lot of the inherited code and keeps that inherited code alive, because that's what we keep bouncing against. In some ways, the way that my mother's code and my father's code got built into me, because my grandparents were two different individuals that got built into my father. So my father inherited the absolute regard for the other from his father, but got some of the preaching and stuff from his mother. And, I got some of the compassion from my father, but got some of the trollish,
Yes.
boundary markings from my mother, who, if my mother hadn't, managed the checkbook and drew lines for my father, the house we lived in would have been not fit for children to grow up in. My mother kept those boundaries.
Right.
This is our home. You can basically, the rule was with my father that he never had any money with him because my mother wouldn't give him any. But if he went out and had preaching or a little bit of extra money, that he could keep for himself. And what did he do with that? The reason she didn't give him money, because he'd always give his money away, because people would ask him for money and he'd always give it.
Right.
And so my mother's like, I'm not giving you too much money because you know what? The children need to eat.
Right. Totally. Yes. Right.
So as a unit, they could figure that out. But as a culture now, we've got this code from Jesus, and well, what does the Jesus code mean with respect to the same-sex attracted person, or the person who feels like their biological sex and their emotional sex are a mismatch? Or what does Jesus have to do with that? And that's what we're working out right now.
Yeah. Right. Right. So in some sense, I think it's just that in some sense, well, actually, you said something earlier in the conversation where you said this thing about prayer, right? Which, like, is it that I'm changed through prayer, or is it that God's changed through prayer? Right? These questions of like, in this sense of prayer, there's one of the things that's there for me is, one of the things I noticed is I don't have a lot of anxiety around the existence of God question for me. And I think some of that has to do with just an actual lack of, I don't come from any place, I don't have any kind of over religious practices in my background, right? So in some senses, I don't have a lot of those anxieties that I'm pressing against or averting or something like that. There's just like and I'm just kind of temperamentally really open, right? So, but I definitely notice the extreme, like the anxiety that people have around this explicit conversation called the existence of God. And I notice I don't have it. I don't have much of it. I'm like, well, let's see if it's I think there's places where it's really interesting, right? Is this kind of conversation about like the theism or not theism, right? Like the sense of there being a personal address. And I one of the things for me where God has always, I guess it's like, I think where I find myself mostly dwelling is in the way in which this sense of the divine or the sacred has this quality of withheldness or concealment, right? And it's in that I notice it's my relationship to this sense of the sacred has this quality of where it reveals itself in its withdrawal in a certain sense. And in the tricky part of this, or I think the personal challenging part of that, right, is not to, well, as if you could, is not to make it unconcealed, but it's behold or be in a relationship with it in such a way that it can reveal without it having to be unconcealed, right? So for example, it's like there's a way in which the unknown, another way of putting that is the unknown, can become present without making it known. And in some senses, right? The unknown, we can become present with that, and making it known is not revealing at all, right? So there's that quality of concealment, which is for me, and actually this comes together. I just thought I found this poem I wrote. If I can share it with you.
Yes, please do.
I wrote this a number of years ago. What is this? Here it is. It's called the Most Asking Question. You planned it this way, didn't you, God? You knew to put yourself just out of our grasp. It's the space between us where we must widen. Oh, so completely unfold to feel the untouchable spot. Ask the unanswerable question and deny ourselves the never satisfied desire that constantly wiggles in our belly. Is this the place, God? The gap between you and I, that is the window where you stand and peer out upon your making. Is that you feeling yourself in my strain? Is that you, God, sitting just behind my eyes as I look for you walking in circles? When the leaf dances delicately in the wind, and for a moment we trade places, and beauty breathes me. Is that you who is satisfied? And is it me wanting more?
That's really beautiful. That's really good.
Thank you.
You should send that to me. That's
Sure will.
That's really good.
Thank you.
The story in Genesis 3, where so the man and the woman are in the garden, and the setting is that in some ways the garden is the royal garden. The temple has been built in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. It's been populated in Genesis 3. Of course, the man and the woman have had the episode by the tree, and the man and the woman hide. And I mean, who told you you were naked? And then there's the fig leaves, and then Peugeot always, the garments of skin, and then the exile from the garden. The foundation of my theological tradition is that God cannot be wielded. What does that mean? That means that, he cannot be grasped.
Yeah.
Because when we grasp something, we know its boundaries. And so your poem is really, I found that deeply moving, because in the what God, to a certain degree, a big part of the exile from the garden is, don't call me, I'll call you. And it really isn't even don't call me, because they do call. And this one of the strange things about the story of the altars don't appear in the Bible until Genesis 4 with Cain and Abel, and they're making sacrifices. There are no sacrifices in the garden. The only implicit ones were the animals that had to offer their skin to cover the man and the woman. And so the strange what you wrote about is a very big deal theologically and in the Bible, because the promise of Scripture, the fulfillment is imagined that we will see each other face to face, us and God. That we will see the face of God. And in Scripture, we're told you can't see the face of God or you will die. And so something in us has to change so that we're able to see it. C.S. Lewis, I think his best novel, it wasn't the Narnia novels, those were children's stories, but a book he wrote, Till We Have Faces. And it's a retelling of a myth, which is, Lewis loved mythology. So it's a retelling of the myth. And just right there, even in the title, Till We Have Faces, the basically underneath the novel, Lewis is making the point, it's not that God doesn't have a face that we can see. It's that we don't have faces through which to see his.
It's not that God doesn't have a face for which we could see. It's that we don't have faces for which to see his.
Right. That's the point of the novel. And how on earth do you get an idea like that across? Well, you write a novel. Yeah. But I really loved your poem. That was really profound and meaningful, because it's so I was just before you, and I'll post it on the channel. I was talking to a guy who has, been fighting cancer for years now, and he's grown spiritually since my first talk with him. My first talk with him was, he was much more in that Petersonian space where, he's sort of interested in religion, but, the whole God thing. And he was more in that space. And when I talked to him today, we were talking about the corruption of institutions and the disappointment of experts in our lives. And I asked him, I said, because he's having to deal with medical establishment all the time because of his fight against cancer. And I said, well, how are you living then in that space where on one hand, you both with reason distrust doctors and medical institutions, but you have to engage them in order to continue to live? And he just said, God. And he talked about how sort of in the moment of pain and distress, God is present, but then often afterwards, after the battle, in the exhaustion, that's when God, in a sense, hides his face, or he can't see God. And of course, what's that?
I mean, when he's exhausted is when he has a hard time seeing God. Yeah.
And of course, at the center of Christianity is Jesus' recitation of Psalm 22 on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? In some ways, one of the pinnacle moments of the drama of Christianity, Christ yells that from the cross. And so I'm a Christian minister, and we've talked about that quite a bit. So we talked quite a bit about the pastoral relationship, but the preaching aspect of my vocation, part of my job is to point to God, to be a sign. But throughout Christianity, the sign of God it's certainly there in the sacraments, but the sign of God is in the lives of the cruciform lives of the Christians. It's in the faithfulness when God himself isn't looking very faithful.
Yeah. Yeah.
which is exactly what the cross is.
Yeah. Yeah. So when on the, so Jesus says that when he's on the cross.
Right. Right.
Well,
my God, why have you forsaken me?
right. What happens after that?
Well, he keeps hanging, he keeps suffering, and there's, then of course in Luke there's this famous conversation with and these are revolutionaries who are being crucified for resisting the Roman occupation. And one of them is mocking Jesus along with everyone else. You're supposed to be a miracle worker. You would think you could use your ostensible privilege with God to avoid this, which is a big reason why many Muslims doubt that the crucifixion happened. And the other person says, why are you mocking this guy? You and I were we were revolutionaries. They're probably being crucified because they killed Roman soldiers. And he said, this other guy, he didn't do anything. Everybody knows who Jesus is. He overturned some money changers, but he didn't kill anyone. In fact, and they probably didn't know this story, but in fact, in the garden when he was arrested and his disciples took up the sword, he healed the work of their swords. And so Jesus hangs and suffers. And after having said, my God, why have you forsaken me? His last words are, into your hands I commit my spirit. So right there you have the dynamic that you have in your poem.
Yeah.
That on one hand, Jesus, in the most alarming, he who spoke of himself as the Son of God and talked about his union with God in a way that would get him killed in a Jewish community, on the same cross declares the abandonment of God, and yet even in that time of abandonment relinquishes himself fully into that abandoning God's arms. And this is the thing about the dynamics of the elements of the Christian drama. It's all of these contrasts.
Yeah.
He who is God is abandoned by God. In the moment of abandonment by God, he relinquishes his soul. Into thy hands I commit my spirit. And and your poem reflects that you can't put these things together. They don't.
Yes. And that, yes, and that somehow, in the strange way, is their togetherness.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And it's in God's concealment that he is revealed.
Yes. Yeah.
That just doesn't sound to make any sense. But there it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And God abandons Jesus on the cross, and so he commits his spirit to him. And if a kid, if some kid grew up and their parent was negligent, and you're going to commit your spirit to the arms of that negligent parent. And this is part of the reason why all of these attempts of, in a portal conversation between Eric Weinstein and Ross Douthat, Eric Weinstein basically says, well, if Jesus was around today, wouldn't we just meme him to death? And it's like, well, you haven't read the Gospels, because that's exactly what they tried. And they didn't just try to destroy his reputation. They hung him naked on a cross, which was destroying Jesus at every level you could destroy a human being. By being hung naked on a cross, you take away all of their dignity, you destroy their reputation, even in an Old Testament way, because the verse in Deuteronomy where, anyone who is hung from a tree is despised, certainly in a karmic way, he must deserve it.
Yeah.
And so the attempt is, go ahead and just try to destroy him in every way you can. And he keeps coming back. Go ahead and hate him, and he will show his love to you. Go ahead and abandon him, and he will give himself fully to you.
Yes.
You can't, and this I think Tom Holland picks up on. This is the deep reprogramming of history that Jesus accomplishes. And of course, that's an audacious statement that if you had made in, let's say, the first century, when the or end of the first century, when the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse, was written, seems totally out of keeping with what anyone would assert. But by 400 years later, few people could deny. And now 2,000 years later, there's a lot of, the only way to really deal with Jesus is to avoid him. That is really the only way. But that then is also the definition of hell. Hell is complete denial and refusal of God. Finally, to say to God, I want to avoid you utterly and completely. And God says, okay, that's hell.
Right. It's that spot right in the middle of that total. It seems like on one level, hell strikes me as something like that spot is a double bind. Like heaven is something like that very same spot is a paradox, right? It's like there's something about that that's so deep to what I don't know. Yeah, it's just because I get in the morning I get up. I've been having this practice for the last about a month or so, pretty much. Every morning I get up and I meditate the sun up, and usually it cooperates. But and then I like deep in my meditation I started praying, right? And I hadn't really prayed in a while, and it's been a striking experience, like, to pray, because it's a strange kind of intimacy. It's very intimate, but in a way that's very odd, in a sense, because there's and what's interesting is of course, I'm meditating, so I'm like kind of, I have this, hour into it or something, the sun's coming up and I'm like just present with what is. And so there's this kind of open sense of awareness, right, that just can notice things. So there's that part of it. So there's a part that's like wide open as I'm praying. So it's like there's the experience of like saying the words, and then there's also just a noticing of the experience of all of it, right, at the same time. That's really open. And what's striking about it is, well, it puts me right in that place of, well, I think it more realizes that place of what I spoke of in the poem is, I don't quite exactly know who's talking to who. Like, yet there is a quality of, well, one is that I'm not expecting an answer. I'm not like I'm speaking, but I'm not expecting an answer. Yet there's a listening, a deep listening in myself that's somehow part of the speaking. But I'm not expecting an answer, yet and I don't know if I'm hearing something, but there's a deep listening. And I'm wondering, what am I listening? Like, what's calling forth that listening? And so in some ways, I think in some ways, and I've noticed that this has been the case I think more, which also I think is just a function of age, right? Is, let's say like the first, I don't know, 40 years or so was, for me, was the question or the pressure was one, life was a kind of pressure to where what seemed to be really important is to make sure that I was someone, right?
Mm.
That that there was a kind of an existential, almost, it felt existential, like a implicit pressure in being is to be
Mm.
someone, right?
Mhm.
And that there's something about that I've been given existence that I found myself in, right?
Mhm.
I don't remember asking for it, right? I don't remember even wanting it, but
Yep,
I
yep.
kind of came to with a first name and a last name, and I'm with a boatload of concerns. So there's this quality of that, what is it? What is it that can justify the fact of my existence? Right? Like what is it? What is it that can justify the most profound gift? And I think when I was younger, it felt implicitly like the way one did that is by becoming someone, right? Um, Helping enough people, or whatever the call was. And now it feels a lot more like a sense of, well, first of all, it seems like I can't actually repay my existence because anything that I do presupposes the existence that I've been given. So there's a sense in which it's unpayable back to, right? There's one of those paradoxes. And I think what's more there now is this sense in which, as Corey Anton would say, you already are more than you've ever accomplished or ever could accomplish, right? There's this sense in just the very facticity of yourself and what we are is already more, right, than I could ever accomplish. And that there's a way in which, and it's funny, I don't know if I can quite put words to it, but there's a quality of where the ethos, the sense of an ethics almost, is one in which it seems to be more about, can I be, how good of a, that part of me which is a host to all of it, can I be a good host, right? Can I be, um can as few moments pass away, um not anonymous in my gaze, right? There's that sense, there's that quality in where it feels a little bit more like that, um the solace or the refuge or the point is to be a sight for God's face, if you will, right? Of be, in some sense, I would imagine, is to, and I think this is probably what's attracted me to Heidegger all these years, is this way that he's continually talking about the clearing, right, or the way in which we are an opening for world, and there's a way in which we can witness it and we get to say what we think about it, right? Which is just stunning. That seems to be, that feels more like, as I've gotten older, I've been noticing I feel a lot less of that pressure to be
Mm.
someone.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more of a sense, and I wouldn't say it's a pressure, it's more like an understanding. It's like way in the background of no, actually, it's like, can I be a really, how profound of a witness can I be, right?
Mm.
How deeply can I be with that it is, right? Not so much what it is, but that this is, right? Just the sense of like, can I, can I, can I actually like allow myself to even come close to how strange it is that there's anything at all, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
like if I'm lucky enough to be able to be shaken by it enough to be able to say a couple of things about it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. And to have and to participate in that, obviously in a Christian frame, the reprogramming that Jesus does, to get back to the middle voice here, happens as you talked about witness. Witness is always is this dual-sided word. It's us being a witness to and being a witness of, and it's this carrying forward into every generation, this programming. That's in a sense how the world gets programmed.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating and profound what you just laid out there. It takes it definitely takes a certain stillness,
Yeah.
especially in our culture,
Yeah.
which is so frenetic,
Right.
so distracted.
Oh yeah.
And I think because it is so deeply anxious, and the word at the time of the exile from the garden is in a sense, you can't get to me, but I will come to you. What that move in terms of the relationship means is that the man and the woman and their children are now going to be profoundly aware of the giftedness of being. Like, just like you said, this has been given to you.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Period. There's no, you didn't ask to come into being.
Yeah.
You cannot secure your being.
Yeah.
It's gift.
Right.
And that,
Down.
what's that?
All the way down.
All the way down.
Right.
And that the facing that leads us often to anxiety because we can't trust the giver. And the kind of peace that we have, I'm not saying we can't trust the giver. We have trust issues. I'll say it that way. We have trust issues.
At least. Yeah.
And so to be at peace with the gift is in some ways to make peace with the giver. And he hasn't been our enemy. He's terror in some ways. He's absolute terror because we are dependent, but he's not our enemy. And I think that is I think that is, oh, my camera overheated, so I'm still here. Okay. I'll let it cool down. I'll turn it back on again in a second. That is in many ways what I see as the heart of the Christian message, which is that what God finally reveals through his Son is that he is not our enemy and he can be trusted, which is in the midst of this brutally painful world, something we desperately need to hear.
Yeah. Yeah.
The last conversation I had, again, talking to someone who's been fighting cancer for the last how many years? He's a young man. He's been reading Russian horror stories, basically, of the 20th century, and there's plenty of them. And it's so interesting that it's in those. I mean, you and I live dramatically privileged lives.
Yeah.
We live in this outstandingly beautiful state, astoundingly affluent. Even in this time of COVID, you and I are fortunate in our career choices.
Mm-hmm.
But and so in one way, it's relatively easy to express trust in the giver of what we've received.
Mm-hmm.
But to those who can very much identify with the cry of the crucified Jesus on the cross, that ability to trust the giver enough to commit his spirit into his hands, that's saying something.
Right. It's a real sovereignty. Talk about sovereignty.
Yeah.
There is a quality of it. It reminds me a little bit about someone once said, I think it was my dad who told me this, for if there's a reason you're forgiving someone, it's not forgiveness. Right?
Exactly.
Right? It's like and I think that says something about the place of what really forgiveness seems to be, which is it's what you're tending to is ontological. It's not conditional, right? So it's like forgiving isn't like, okay, I've been able to understand enough such that I can weigh it out in myself such that I forgive you, right? It's more like, this is why I think that like a good measure, it seems, is like, well, I've noticed it seems to be there's a huge correlation between where people are suffering, right, and their level of judgment. Seem to go hand in hand, right? Like, and it also where people seem to be most genuinely open and in a flow, and is now I'm not talking about discernment, I'm talking about judgment, which seems to be this thing that I think must come involved in when we trust, because there is a quality of where there is something in which at the end of the day, I think that's something that no one can do for me. Like they can't give me the experience of me trusting them, right? Or the experience of me seeing them as trustable. There is this quality where that seems to be a very, very deep relationship with myself, right? That is an act of, it's a generous act. Like you think about it, it's a very generous act. I always feel that it is. When people trust me, there's always a sense where it's like I feel a sense of where I feel the generativity of them.
Yes.
Like I don't. It's not like I look at myself and feel super proud of myself. Like because there is a recognition of where it's actually that's where it is. It's if you wanted me to lose.
And it's even in our language. We extend trust. In the direction.
Yes.
We extend trust.
And here's the other thing about trust, though, too, is I don't know I don't know if I stop trusting somebody. I think it's like I start trusting something else.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because I've noticed that around in conversations in my, you know, wherever there's people, you'll you'll have these kind of conversations, but when somebody says like, I don't trust you, or I don't trust them, it's really interesting how there's this strange stop where all the action stops and it's almost impenetrable. It's like, all right, you don't trust me, or you don't trust them, or you don't trust it, or everything, all of your participation and the quality of that participation is banking on that. And that's something that if it's not there, it seems like it's so difficult to penetrate that. And so what I started to do with people is I was like, okay, so like let's just say that you couldn't not trust. Let's just say all you could do is you could say, I used to trust you, and now I trust what? Some thought about you or some sense of investing, right?
That's really good. That's really good. And I think that scales. That scales not just in terms of interpersonal, but also people's identity within, called the agent arena relationship, their identity within whatever worldview they're inhabiting. That it is that you start trusting something else. I think that's really true and quite right.
Because otherwise, the responsibility is still on the thing, right? But and then maybe it's also probably a really good thing. Like Jesus, there is a lot worth not trusting, right?
Yeah.
Like obviously, right? Yeah, but that sense in which that is a real sovereign, where I trust and where I don't trust is really sovereign, right? When it comes down to it, I think, or can be.
And I've really appreciated and benefited a lot from John's work. His Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. He took 50 hours to lay all that stuff out,
right?
And his 4 P's of knowing is something that I've used a lot because it, that participatory, that perspectival. I mean, that's really, and as as a Christian minister, that's what I've seen in people. It's, I'm not going to say that none of the propositional is important. No, that's got its place and it's got its, but I think the participatory and the procedural, which both trust is at that level, and there's certainly other elements of the propositional and the procedural. I almost always forget one of those darn P's.
Propositional, yeah.
Propositional, procedural, perspectival, participatory. There they all are. Trust hits more of them. Trust almost hits them all at a deep way, more than many of the other things that we're dealing with.
Right.
And so it is such a key. It is such a key to life. Again, you can go back to the Genesis 3 story, and the fall happens. What where the serpent attacks is their ability to trust their maker. That's exactly where the serpent puts his finger and says, "This is where I'm going to push." And if I dislocate that, everything else slides. And I see so again, another aspect of pastor is being with people in their relational miseries. And And so often it comes down to, you have to trust this other person if you're going to. I think you said it very well, that you can't, a huge correlation with their level of suffering and their level of judgment. I can't trust that other person, or there's their misery. Well, you have to trust that other person, but they're trustworthy. That's true. And so there are limits, there are boundaries, but if you're actually going to make progress in this relationship, you're going to have to extend trust one more time.
Yeah.
And you might get burned again. We're not, there's no guarantees here, but that's the path. And so, and the forgiveness, your father's saying about forgiveness, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not a reason. Forgiveness is not a reason.
Right. Yeah. There's no reason for it. I mean, maybe like, so your so your name just doesn't point to a contraction, right? Like, but ultimately, yeah, you're right. Because there is a, this is one of the things that's interesting about intimacy, right? That's striking to me is, when I think of the family systems, people talk about intimacy being a function of your ability to tolerate anxiety. And specifically, a particular kind of anxiety that comes up in relationship. If you say that, like, like maybe you and I become intimate, there's bullseyes to that, like, layers and layers and layers, right? And that usually when you get close to a layer is where you get these moments where these two fundamental drives to be human is, one, I want to like dissolve in everything I call good and have absolute belonging and reassurance that it's going to be there forever, right? And then the other one is to stand out in my cosmic uniqueness, right? And that's what it is to be human. And then just press go, right? And wonder why. But in intimacy, it's usually that sense, isn't it, where all of a sudden something, there's a moment where I want something that looks like it may threaten our relationship, right? Or there's a truth that if I say it, right, you could go away, right? And intimacy is really seems to be about those moments where you go right to the eye of the needle with somebody. And what's interesting to me is like watching this happen over and over again and working with couples. It's another thing I do is like work a lot with, couples and coach them and stuff. Is when they do, in some sense, say it, right? Oftentimes, what's interesting about this is like they didn't say it because they were almost certain that if they said it, X, Y, and Z would happen. Therefore, I'm not going to say it, right? And then
they had reason.
Saying it, yes. And then not saying it, right, gets to this point where it hurts too much to not say it, then even though X, Y, and Z, and then they say it. And usually, the very reason why they didn't say it happens. Some version of it happens, right? And so on one level, you can go, well, that justifies me not saying it because I knew that was going to happen. But because he didn't say it, right? You're now in territory that you couldn't be otherwise, right? No. And so now, because you weren't in that territory, now you can start to observe it and be with it and in the presence of it. And I think in that sense is where, coming back to trust, what do I trust when I say what's true for me, even though I'm afraid that you will go away or something will dissolve or something will go away that I can't feel like I can survive, right? And what am I trusting actually when I say that, right? Because the first level is like oftentimes the very thing I'm afraid of happens. But what's interesting about that is because I do it, I volunteer. And it's not just, especially it's not it's even more than just volunteer. It's extra duty volunteer because I'm precisely really scared to say it. So volunteering is really, really, it's a real frontal forward stepping into it, trusting. And there's something about that no matter how it, I think I've noticed is that no matter what happens after that, the the thing that seems to be trustworthy is that it ultimately ends up leading to something that it can be very, very transforming, right? Like, and I think there's just that one element that because I think a lot of the reasons why we avoid vulnerability, right, is because of our experiences of being exposed before. And so if we have that mapped over with vulnerability, right, exposure is that thing where it's like, like someone pulls your pants down or like something suddenly happens and you're faced with your like humiliation and you're surprised by it in some way. That's exposure, right? Well, vulnerability though is actually kind of maybe perhaps doing the exact same thing except for you step into it. And so in that sense, it's like no matter how the outcome of that particular situation turns out, the self that one gets to transcend and become through it, I think is the thing is what is trustworthy as far as I know.
Yeah. Well, Peterson gets at that in 12 Rules. It's the voluntary. I mean, the thing about telling the truth, it's the voluntary aspect. It's that direction that changes it, and you can turn the tables on. You can turn the tables on a lot of it has to do with agency.
Yeah.
That your agency is broadened, not narrowed. No, it's very true. Well, Guy, we're coming up on 2 hours here.
Yeah, I mean, I could keep going, but I should probably.
I know, so could I.
Or I have another meeting with the band is getting back together. Chris and John and Jordan Hall. We're meeting, I think, at 2:30. So.
Good. Good. Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for, as always, you're a masterful listener and a very satisfying conversation partner.
Absolutely. Love being with you, my friend.
And one of these days, hopefully
we'll meet,
this COVID scourge will pass. We can be each other in the flesh, which would be much better.
Yes.
Okay, Guy. Take care. Bye-bye.